term Naseh v'nishma comes in our Torah portion. It's a part of the Torah portion that when people teach the Ten Commandments, this part is, as it were, overlooked because it doesn't really fit with the narrative that we like to tell with the Ten Commandments. So I'll break this down a little bit. So if you'd like to go with me, this is just a part one of a few words I have today. Go with me to Exodus chapter 24. If you'd like to open up Exodus chapter 24. Now, Exodus chapter 24 happens after God making great promises to the people. So it goes from laws, civil law, criminal law, ritual law, to a very inspiring section here, where it talks about God bringing the people out of Egypt, going into the land of Canaan, driving out the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites. And by the way, when you read anything about driving out the Canaanites, driving out the 7 Canaanite nations, there's a little bit of biblical scholarship here. This is obviously written at a time when they were already gone. How do we know this? If you look in the book of Samuel, life of King David is surrounded by the indigenous population. You maybe remember that David's across the street neighbor is Uriah HaHittite, Uriah the Hittite. Uriah the Hittite's wife is Bathsheba, and Uriah is a captain in David's army. So if all of the Hittites, etc., were driven out when people came into the land, why is King David's across the street neighbor a Hittite and serving in David's army? So here we have some anachronisms in the Bible. By the time of the book, when the book of Deuteronomy was written, let's say right before the destruction of the temple, so we put Deuteronomy at around 600 BCE, but the time of King David, etc., around 900, even 1000 BCE. But the text that we have parts of the Deuteronomic text written in 600 BCE interpolated back into earlier textual streams. Now, this is makes reading the Bible a little bit difficult if you really want to know what the Bible has to say, because you might be reading something, for example, here in the book of Exodus, that you think was written during the time when the book of Exodus was written, let's say 700 BCE or so, but written from the perspective of 600 BCE, when the indigenous populations had assimilated. There's no evidence that, as it says in the book of Joshua, that there was a big war and they were driven out, but rather they simply assimilated into Israelite population. However, if you're living at the time of Deuteronomy and you notice there are no more of the 7 Canaanite nations, what happened to them? Then you might think that back in the time of Joshua, they were driven out of the land or they were exterminated in war. There's no evidence that happened because all those narratives were written in the 600s. If you look at texts that are roughly contemporaneous, for example, around King David, they're still there. So biblical scholars say, how could Joshua have driven out or killed all of the 7 Canaanite nations when just a little bit later, King David lives across the street from some of them? Okay. Doesn't make any sense unless you see that the different texts are written at different times in history, and we don't have to figure out these anachronisms. They're simply texts written at different times. The editor then interpolated text from a later time into an earlier time, or an earlier time into a later time. Now, why is this worth your while? Because many people get befuddled, have conundrums about what the text means, and they simply really haven't internalized the idea that the Torah has at least 4 great sources: the so-called J source, where God is referred to as Adonai; the E source, where God is referred to as Elohim; the so-called P source, priestly source, which is, by the way, the source of many of our laws. The P source is interested in organizing reality. For example, Genesis chapter 1 is a so-called priestly source. Don't take the word priestly too seriously. Think of organizational mind. Genesis chapter 1 is organizational. Genesis chapter 2, chapter 3, God and Adam and Eve, the Garden of Creation, that's actually much more of a narrative. Well, the organizational stream is chapter 1. The narratival stream is chapter 2. So therefore, who wrote the laws that we have in the Decalogue and the Ten Commandments and in Torah portion of Mishpatim, we're going to call it the organizing mind. Let's organize the society according to rational laws of justice, clear instructions on how to organize society. You might think of like an extension of Genesis chapter 1. Just as reality is organized, so should society be organized. Then we jump toward the end of our Torah portion, great narratives, and then the part I want to read to you today. We're not sure where this comes from. It doesn't seem to be Deuteronomic, so it's some kind of a great narrative that has been placed into our Torah portion. So here we see the organized mind is chapter 21, 22, 23, and then a different source is chapter 24. So let me go ahead and read what we have in chapter 24. So in chapter 20, at the end of chapter 23, verse 32, it says, "You shall not seal a covenant with them," meaning the indigenous population or their gods, believing that when you seal a covenant with the indigenous population, you'll start to worship their gods. And again, that is probably a later point of view, trying to understand why during the time of the end of the First Temple period, let's say the time of King Josiah, why were the Israelites so addicted to idolatry? If you read the different prophets, Hosea, Amos, etc., one problem is social justice. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The treatment of the widow, poor, orphan, and stranger. Another part is an addiction to idolatry. It's just hard to understand it. I'll share with you a thought of mine in a moment, but the addiction to idolatry from the perspective of the later biblical authors was because there were still vestiges of idolatry in the land, and when people met up with idolatry, they couldn't resist it. What was the deep attraction of idolatry, of polytheism, even to child sacrifice? What was the addiction, and how was the addiction finally addressed? So when it says don't seal a covenant with them and don't worship their gods, they were seen as kind of a cause and effect. If you seal a covenant with them and you get to know them and you go to dinner at their houses and your children intermarry, you will end up worshiping their idolatrous gods. You see this in the at the end here. Chapter 23, verse 23, "Do not seal a covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they cause you to sin against me." Now, again, they might already be gone from the land because of assimilation. But again, even with assimilating the 7 Canaanite nations into the Israelite population, it didn't mean that some of their idolatrous traditions remained. We'll now go on to 24. So let me go ahead and say a quick word about the problem with idolatry as worshiping idols. Remember, one of the achievements of biblical religion was while there might be angels, and sometimes angels are called Elohim, meaning lower order gods, one of the achievements of biblical thought is you might call it the supreme God, El Elyon. And El Elyon was mostly interested in 2 very basic things. One is moral behavior, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. We'll talk about that today a little bit more. So the idea that the sovereign God of the universe, El Elyon, had a supreme concern, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, to do righteousness in judgment, or that might be a Hinditis. Tzedakah u'mishpat might just simply mean righteous law. Tzedakah u'mishpat, righteous law. That it is from a biblical perspective. By the way, that's from the book of Genesis chapter 18. That seems to be a kind of a Deuteronomic language, retrojected back into Genesis. That's not our concern, because the biblical authors wanted us to know that when God was communicating to Abraham what this is all about, God says, la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, to do righteous judgment, v'lishmor derech Adonai, and keep the way of Adonai. So if you want a one sentence, one brief phrase, what is biblical Judaism? That's a bit of an anachronism because it wasn't called Judaism until Judah, but we'll be a little bit anachronistic right now. What is biblical religion, Israelite religion, Judaism all about? 2 things. La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, to do righteous judgment, to be moral, to be ethical, and to have our legal system reflect our morals and our ethics. That's one side. V'lishmor derech Adonai, and keep the way of Adonai, or keep the way of God. Just two thoughts. Be moral/ethical, which includes having a legal system rooted in ethics, number one. Number two, to keep the way of God. Now, these refers to two core aspects, you might say, of human behavior from a religious perspective. First, the requirement to be moral. A religious person who's not rooted in ethics, in character, and the world of morality, from this perspective, is not a religious person. They're just a pretend religious person. They might look like a religious person. They might look like they're doing religious things. They may be dressed up that way. They may be lighting candles. There's all kinds of external things a person can do. But from a Jewish perspective, if they're not committed to good character, if they're not committed to moral outcomes, if they're not committed to a just society with special care for the widow, poor, orphan, and stranger, it's not Judaism. It's something else. In fact, it's kind of monstrous that a person is dressed up in Judaism, but there's actually something like the picture of Dorian Gray. You look one way, but within there's a deep sense of corruption. By the way, if you look at the prophets are aghast and are repelled by the idea that a person could display religious affectations, but their heart is not committed to lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, creating a ethical person in a just society. They're just performing the external appearances. This is deeply offensive to the prophets. If you look at the first chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah is offended by the idea that a person doesn't match religious behavior with the content of character and the commitment to create a just society. We'll put that aside. So what is lishmor derech Hashem? What does it mean to keep the way of Adonai, as is said in the book of Genesis chapter 18? It has to do mostly with a devotional practice. The way of the divine is an inner path to connect yourself with God. You can call it the divine, you can call it the source of reality, whatever term is most useful to you. It requires two ideas or three ideas. We do have an inner life. We do have the free will to conduct our inner life. And there's something called the divine, the source of all life, as I was saying in my class on Aristotle on Tuesday night. Some force that communicates the idea of the good, of the holy, of love, justice, truth, and beauty down into the consciousness of the human being. You can choose to keep it out. You can choose to repel it. You can choose to hear it but not take it seriously. Or you can choose to conform your life around it. That's a deep part of the human condition. Is there a force coming into you, into your spirit, into your conscience? A spirit of the divine, of the holy. Kabbalistically, I would say love, justice, truth, and beauty. Is it flowing into you? And it flows as it flows into you. Do you allow it to shape the way that you think, feel, emote, etc., etc.? That's part of human choice. Now, it's a strange thing because a person says, how can I have a part of me that decides to accept these things? We'll go into that another time. But I have to tell you, when you think very deeply about these things, very deeply how you want to live your life, what is your goal today for your character? What is your lifetime goal for your character? What is your lifetime goal for how you conduct your relationships? Do you have a vision for how all this ought to turn out? And this goal is rational. I mean, you're going to really think about what you do and the consequences of what you do, how you respond, the consequences of how you respond, the life decisions you make at what I'll call the character perspective, the consequence of those decisions. One thing that we talk about in the class on Aristotle, and one of the benefits of studying Aristotle, by the way, we're studying his book, the so-called Nicomachean Ethics, just this means Aristotle's Ethics, is how he much focuses on page after page, paragraph after paragraph, on how much human deliberation is required to create out of yourself a person of good character. Aristotle says it comes with a sense of eudaimonia, the well-being you're trying to create at the end, and then creating the habits that create eudaimonia. Very much of my wisdom works teaching, by the way, is rooted in Aristotle and his interpreters, but with one addition that comes out of religious language, which is you don't do it because it's the ideal for human flourishing. You do it because it's the law. Yes, it ought to lead to human flourishing, but we're also required to do it. So Aristotle does not have much sense of the mitzvah, of the moral, as it were, spiritual obligation to do it. Aristotle is very weak on obligation. He does not seem to understand obligation. The idea of obligation, I think, really comes from the philosophically from the biblical and Jewish idea of mitzvah. When you combine Aristotle's book on character and the biblical rabbinic idea of mitzvah, then I think you have a pretty complete theory of what you might call the ethical personality. So, therefore, what does it mean, Lishmor derech Hashem? One part of it means is to ingest all of this, what I'll call the right, the good, the just, the true, etc. But there's another side to Lishmor derech Hashem, which is simply to experience the depth of the divine flowing into you. I call this spirituality at its purest sense, that my spirit is a receptacle for the divine spirit. So in understanding what Judaism is, go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 18, I think it's 18:15. God turns the camera and says, shall I tell Abraham what this is all about? Lishmor derech Adonai, to keep the way of Adonai, lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, and do righteous judgment. All right, so what is Torah portion Mishpatim, the Torah portion for today? It's mostly tzedakah u'mishpat. It's mostly the delineation, as much as possible, what does it mean, lasot tzedakah u'mishpat? What does righteous judgment actually mean? That's our Torah portion. So at the end of our Torah portion, there's an assumption. We've heard the Decalogue, the Aseret HaDibrot. We've heard the basics of tzedakah u'mishpat. And now we have this little bit of an interlude where God says to Moses, so we're in chapter 24 now, go up to Hashem. It seems out of order. We thought he's already at the top of the mountain. We're not going to try to solve that one today. Nadav, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and 70 elders, and prostrate yourselves from a distance, apparently from the top of the mountain. Moses alone will go to the top. They shall not approach. The people won't go with them. Then it says, Moses came and told the people all the words of Adonai. This seems like a repetition of Exodus chapter 19. We'll leave scholars to figure out if this is a repetition of Exodus 19, what is it doing here at the end of Exodus chapter 24? Well, you can study that on your own. And he told the people all of the words of Adonai and all the ordinances, and the entire people responded with one voice, and they said, all of the words that Adonai has spoken, we will do. So this is at the end of verse 3. It says, Kol ha-devarim asher diber Adonai na'aseh, we shall do. And then the ritual of actually establishing the covenant, look in verse 7. He took the book of the covenant and read it in the earshot of all the people. And they said, everything that Adonai has said, we will do and we will obey. Now here is where Na'aseh v'nishma comes in. Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. That's the source of Na'aseh v'nishma. And again, in Hebrew it says, Na'aseh v'nishma, we shall do and we shall obey, as if it's linear. It's not linear, it's a hendiadys, two words expressing one sentiment, we shall obediently do. Everything that Adonai has said, we shall obediently do. Then what does Moses do? There's clearly some kind of sacrifice going on. He takes the blood from the sacrifice and he throws it on the people and says, behold the blood of the covenant that God has sealed with you concerning these matters. Wow, this is some old-time religion. Okay? How was the covenant sealed? An animal is sacrificed. He announces the terms of the covenant. You have to obey all of this. Takes the blood of the sacrificed animal. So the blood, remember, is the life force, is the nephesh of the animal. It's as if the divine spirit enters into the nephesh of the animal, and our nephesh, our blood life force, is connected to the life force of the universe, symbolized by the blood. God splashes it on the people. Boom, we're in the covenant. Now, in the Talmud, This is where the idea of the covenant between God and the people of Israel is actually established in a formal way here in Exodus 24. Now, in Genesis, God is already speaking about the covenant with Abraham. You have the covenant brought up over and over again. The mystery of the covenant is in Exodus chapter 24, some primitive atavistic ritual. How do we set up a covenant? Read the terms of the covenant. Everybody says, we are completely in. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will obediently do it. He takes from the pan. He splashes the blood on the people in the covenant forever. Their descendants, including their biological and spiritual descendants, which means any person who has chosen Judaism, when you choose Judaism, you went back to that moment. You said Na'aseh v'nishma, and the blood of the covenant was thrown onto you as well. The rabbis say, some rabbis say, that the mikvah is a substitution for the blood of the covenant. When you go into the mikvah, it's as if you're going back to Exodus chapter 24, and you are, as it were, going into the blood of the covenant. I know it's a kind of a grotesque term, but as I said, this is old-time religion. What does that mean? That the nefesh of the human being, it says in the Bible that the nefesh is in the blood. So think of nefesh here not as soul, but as life force. The life force of the human being, the nefesh of the human being, is in the blood, as it were. It's an ancient belief that the nefesh of the divine is somehow the life force of the divine is communicated to us, and the animal sacrifice mediates between the life force of the divine and the life force of the human being. So this ritual you see here, which for me is certainly off-putting, I have to understand it in terms of biblical language. That was the meaning of animal sacrifice. The blood of the animal was the life force of the divine. We use the life force of the divine in the animal to establish a connection between the life force of the human being and the life force of the divine. Now, we don't do that anymore, but I don't want you to read this and say, oh my God, how disgusting. I want you to understand what it meant from their time, the mystery of the life force, the mystery of what creates life force. The blood goes out, the animal dies, the human being dies. If the blood is circulating as it should, we're alive. So whatever our life force is, it's in the blood. How does the blood get the life force? From God. There's a deep mystery here in ancient thought. Now, what comes next is going to really blow your mind if you've never read this carefully. Moshe, this is now verse 9, chapter 24, verse 9. Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and the 70 elders ascended. And look at what it says. It says in Hebrew, Vayir'u et Elohei Yisrael. They saw the God of Israel. What can that possibly mean? They saw the God of Israel. We learned that God has no body, that God has no form. Well, they saw something, so we would say a manifestation. They had a vision. And when they saw this vision of the God of Israel, v'tachat raglav, and underneath the feet. Now, just this idea, they saw the God of Israel, and underneath his feet, this drives Maimonides crazy. Maimonides, as an Aristotelian, says God is infinite, has no place, has no location, has no physical attributes. So if you look in the Guide for the Perplexed, when Maimonides discusses this verse, he wants to go at great lengths to say this is a human interpretation of a spiritual experience, where the spiritual experience of the divine, because of the nature of human consciousness, we create an image. It's a very important idea. And here I'll go along with Maimonides. I don't believe that divine has a specific physical form. However, when we have mystical experiences of the divine, our natural human capacity to translate spiritual experience into what you might call the idiom of the mind, which is to see physicality, it's natural. We just not take it too seriously, meaning it's not as if they saw God, but they had an experience of God that the mind translated into a physical vision. Now look what it says. And under the feet in this vision, whatever it was like, it says, K'ma'aseh livnat hasapir. It was like sapphire brickwork. And then it says, V'che'etzem hashamayim latohar, and the essence of heaven in purity. They saw the God of Israel, and somehow under the feet or the base was a likeness of sapphire brickwork. It was like the essence of heaven in purity. What an incredible description of a mystical, spiritual experience where the mind translates the experience into a physical idiom and then goes back to a non-physical idiom, the essence of the heaven in purity. How do you even describe that? How do you even write about that? The etzem hashamayim batohar. Make sure I have that right. La tohar. Etzem hashamayim la tohar. And then it says, the next part, this has always made me chuckle, still makes me chuckle. Against the great men of Israel, the Atzilim, those to whom God emanate God's self, he did not stretch out his hand. We're not sure what that means. Look at the next line, verse 11. They gazed at God. It says, Vayechezu et ha-Elohim, they gazed at God, ve'achlu vayishtu, and they ate and drank. You can almost hear the commentators yelling off the page in the commentary. What could it possibly mean? After all this mystical experience, and they gazed upon God, v'achlu vayishtu, and they ate and drank. Again, the first time I read this, I laughed. I had no idea what it meant, but I just imagined people, there's God. There's the essence of the heavens in purity, and there's the sapphire brickwork, and can you hand me the ketchup? I mean, just the image of their eating and drinking. So the commentators need to know what this says. Someone said it was an awful lack on their part. They were hungry. So, okay, enough spirituality, we need to eat. And this was a very bad thing. Others say, and I'm giving you my interpretation, it was like a Passover Seder. How do you seal a covenant? You share a holy meal. And that's what the Passover Seder is. The Passover Seder is sealing a covenant through a holy meal. So meals were understood to be a way to seal a covenant. So it's a kind of a communion. I mean, when you think of communion in Christianity, there's the wafer and there's the wine. Think of Passover as communion, where the community are coming together, eating the sacred animal, the lamb, drinking the 4 cups of wine, and that the Spirit of God, as it were, that was in Egypt comes among us, and we are sealed together as a community and between us and God. So I believe that what we see here, because there's no sense of judgmentalism here in the Bible, that the idea that we seal the covenant through this meal. And then we seem to have a reworking of the book of Exodus chapter 32. Moses ascended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain, the glory of Adonai rested on Mount Sinai, covered it for a 6-day period. He called to Moses on the 7th day. The appearance of the glory of Adonai was like a consuming fire on the mountaintop before the children of Israel. Moses arrived in the midst of the cloud, ascended the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Now we're headed back to connecting Torah portion Yitro with the revelation at Mount Sinai to Genesis 32. I know I packed a lot in here. I just want to say my first point for today, I think I've used up almost all my time. If you want to study Ma'amad Har Sinai, the stand of the people at Mount Sinai, and the revelation at Mount Sinai, make sure to add Exodus 24 when you study it. Read Exodus 20 plus Exodus 24. That's one thing. The rabbis want to say it's out of place. This properly should be at the end of Exodus 20 or right before Exodus 32. The editors of the Bible put it here for a very specific reason. I'll let you try to figure it out. Now, the last thing I want to say today, I didn't know I was going to go on with Exodus 24 so much, but it really is worthy of deep study. And that is Rashi's comment on our Torah portion, very briefly. Rashi and the rabbinic tradition says, all these delineations of tzedakah u'mishpat, righteous judgment, Human reason can get to it. This idea, again, is a very Aristotelian idea. Certainly it's part of the Jewish idea that tzedakah and mishpat one can arrive at it through sechel. Rational, deliberative judgment can help you work out moral dilemmas. If you're rational, you're propelled by the commandment to do the good, the right, the true, some kind of sense of the consequences of our decisions, somewhere between the duty and the ends. A rational person can figure it out. But there's two things. Most of us don't have enough learning to figure it out because we're biased, because we're interested, because we're upset, because we're blinded, that sometimes we're bribed by our own motives. People make all kinds of rationalizations when they think they're solving an ethical dilemma, but they're basically voting for their own side. In fact, many philosophers say there are no ethical dilemmas. It's just people justifying what they want to do anyway. For example, David Hume, whom I read him. I don't like to teach him. I'm much more in the idea of that there really are moral duties, the natural law tradition. But Rashi and others are very emphatic. We don't really need this Torah portion because if we taught you how to think rationally and morally, which means your moral duties with rational thinking to a moral outcome, you could probably figure this out. But none of us are smart enough. None of us know what we're doing. So, Rashi had to say, God laid it out for us, and Rashi says, as a shulchan aruch, as a prepared table, everything right in front of you. Your job is to study it, understand it, deliberate on it, discuss it, as if you're sitting at a shulchan aruch, a prepared table of divine statements on how to be a moral person. We bring ourselves to the table. We take out our humashim. We take out our Bibles. This is the food on the table, and we study. And Rashi has one other comment here that I want to share with you, and he says, but the main thing that it's communicating here is that the rational work to understand what the morally right thing to do is our own act of revelation. Meaning, and again, this is completely absent in Aristotle. Aristotle says the goal is well-being. The Jewish tradition says the goal is aligning your consciousness with the divine consciousness. Now, I don't think they're terribly different in effect, but try to imagine one is have a theory of well-being, understand what your axioms are, think rationally, arrive at well-being. The Jewish tradition would say, know that there's something called the divine will in this case, we just don't know what it is. It's a different starting place. Ideally, when you tap into the divine will, that will create osher, eudaimonia. Notice the different ending place. Therefore, start with duties that more or less are communicated in our textual tradition. It's a good place to start. We don't have to invent everything on our own. Then think rationally. Sechel is a gift from God. And you arrive at what is roughly the will of God. I'm making it sound way too easy, but I want you to get the difference in tone. One tone is your goal is well-being, eudaimonia. The other tone is you're arriving at the will of the divine, which produces eudaimonia in most cases, if you begin with the right duties, if you think well, and after the right goal. Now, what does all of this add to it? I'll just share a brief anecdote, and I promise I'll stop for today. Sometimes when I'm teaching people what I call the beginnings of the virtue path, and no 4 C's, no bad Jedi, no defensiveness, memorized scripts rooted in wisdom. Wow, the resistance is palpable. They want to get defensive, and they want to tell the story, and they want to give the narrative. I was wronged. I was wrong. I was right. I got to the whole Megillah. Megillah. Everybody has a Megillah to tell. When it's basically how to speak properly and morally with virtue. People have such strong resistance, and they say, "You know what? I get it. You're right. This is true. No 4 C's, no criticizing, complaining, condemning, harsh language, escalating conflict. Knock off the fetal defensiveness. Get your mind around it. Speak very simply. Just forget all this narrativizing and justifying my side. I really get it." And people say to me, Why do I have so much trouble with it? And why, when I try to do something so obvious, do I have such anxiety? Have you ever felt that? You're really trying to live the moral path and you just feel anxiety within. So from a Jewish spiritual psychological perspective, here's what's happening. Your Yetzer Hara knows you're closing in. Your Yetzer Hara knows that you're closing in and you're saying, no speaking harshly, no criticizing, knock off the complaining, knock off with the fetal defensiveness. Don't make everything you say have to have this all-involved big Megillah of your narrative. Just do it simple and true. Your Yetzer Hara begins to panic. And when your Yetzer Hara begins to panic, you have anxiety. What is your anxiety? It's the panic of the Yetzer Hara that you know you have finally seen it and you're after it. The Yetzer Hara is afraid you're going to kill it. Now, you can't kill it, but the Yetzer Hara don't know that. So I just want to share with all of you, as you study all of this and you're working toward it, if something happens inside that says, but I'm being resistant, I don't think I want to do it. That's not you. That's your Yetzer Hara fighting against you as you seek toward your authentic fulfillment as a human being.